Good evening and welcome to the third Awarelogue Lecture Forum. This Awarelogue Lecture Forum marks a very significant anniversary. The year 2021 marks the 30th anniversary of India's Prime Minister in the 1980s, the second half of the 1980s, Rajiv Gandhi. He was assassinated in 1991, having been Prime Minister from 1984 to 1989. So on this particular session of the Awarelogue Lecture Forum, we have the distinct pleasure of having invited a very senior Indian academic, someone who needs no introduction in Indian circles and who is very well known in Sri Lanka as well, who is going to be speaking to us on India-Sri Lanka relations during Rajiv Gandhi's premiership. To speak a few words of welcome about Professor Karori Singh, he is currently an Emeritus Fellow at the South Asia Studies Center at the University of Rajastan, a university that he has been affiliated with for nearly 4 decades, having started off in 1982. As a professor, he's been involved in research and in teaching at the university, and also served as the former director of the South Asia Studies Center. So we're indeed honored to have you with us today, Professor. Thank you so much for taking time to come on board to share your views, your ideas, and help us understand that much more India-Sri Lanka relations during Rajiv Gandhi's premiership. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. George, and good evening, everyone. When we understand relations between two nation states, one small state, other one is the big state, then we have 3 major frameworks through which we can understand relation. First is a theoretical conceptual framework in which we can explain what type of relations can be between two states. In that framework, the neo-realist theory suggests that every nation state is defensive positional. Every nation state tries to defend its position which that nation state is holding. And from that point of view, neither India is going to displace Sri Lanka from its position, nor Sri Lanka is going to displace India from its position. So there is no logic that there will be some kind of hostile or relations between the two nation states. But there may be certain irritants, there may be certain differences, there may be certain disputes because of certain historical experiences and because of certain circumstances. So the second framework is the historical experience. What the Sri Lanka and India have a historical experience. For India, Sri Lanka is not just another nation state. For Sri Lanka to India is not just another nation state. As Mahinda Rajapaksa during his first term of president, he described India-Sri Lanka relation that India is in our relation. It means relative. Whereas Japan and China, they are the friends. So if we have some problem, some difficulty, we will consult India, we will go to India. So the India and Sri Lanka, they are close. They are not just another country. So from the historical experience point of view, when we see the India-Sri Lanka relations, particularly during the post-colonial period, it can be understood in different phases. During the first 3 decades, that is the first phase, there were certain disputes, certain irritants. When the stateless persons issue came into focus, the citizenship issue, there are the maritime boundary issue, that these are the natural issues. They can be between 2 neighbors. So these 2 issues which came up during the first phase of India-Sri Lanka relations, that I call the 3 decades. So these issues were amicably resolved. Of course, it took some long time because the negotiating process takes time. It's not the one-day affair. So these issues were resolved, like stateless persons, citizenship issue, maritime boundary issue. I'm not saying which country was more accommodative and which country was more aggressive, but these issues were resolved. So that was not the so disturbing period over the first 3 decades of relations between these two neighbors. The second phase is the 80s. That I call the dangerous decade between the two nation states. And during this period, so many problems cropped up, then a sort of difficult situation has been created. And thereafter, the next decade of 90s, I call it the decade of indifference. Neither Sri Lanka was coming so close to India, nor India was taking much interest in Sri Lankan affairs. And thereafter, with the dawn of the 21st century, the decade of optimism came into being. And thereafter, the second decade of this 21st century, the relations were moved in a particular direction. But that's not my focus to describe all and understand all these edges of the relations. But whatever the relations we had during the decade or dangerous decade, it has certain legacies. And these legacies had some impact on India-Sri Lanka relations. And thereafter, after the end of this decade of dangerous, it has certain imprints in the during the 21st century and decade of 90s. So the dangerous decade has certain legacies and it had certain imprints. But to describe and analyze the legacies and to analyze the imprints, that is not my purpose. Our purpose is very limited to understand one decade. So what India's position, because the basic foreign policy principles of both the countries are almost similar. There's hardly any difference between the foreign policy principles because of both the democratic countries, both have a particular type of colonial history and all these things, so many factors are there. So there is no basic difference between the foreign policy principles in both the countries. What India expects, what India has a perception of the Sri Lanka and what Sri Lanka has a perception of India and its foreign policy. India had abiding faith in unity, sovereignty, and integrity of Sri Lanka. India wants to solve the Sri Lankan ethnic problem for once and all. This is the India's abiding faith. Then India expects from Sri Lanka to remain sensitized towards India's strategic and security problems, particularly the maritime security in the Indian Ocean. I don't think it is illegitimate expectation. This is expectation by any country. Even Sri Lanka has so many expectations from India being a close neighbor. Then the fourth one is India is having to expand the trade relations. It is evident from the relations during the post-colonial period, trade relations, developmental relations, and the commercial relations, and the development cooperation. That is the India's perception. But the Sri Lanka's perception is that anything that counters the Sri Lanka's integrity, unity, and sovereignty, then the Sri Lanka will have hostile relations and Sri Lanka will not accept, Sri Lanka will react to that. That is the legitimate thing. The second thing, Sri Lanka wants to resolve the ethnic problem. So there is no difference between the two countries. Then the Sri Lanka wants to sustain its strategic autonomy, its independent foreign policy, and there sometimes misperceptions are being created by media portrayals, sometimes by hawkish think tank perception on both the sides. So sometimes misunderstandings are being created. Then the Sri Lanka wants to make its foreign policy as instrument to accelerate the development and increase investment and have a development of Sri Lanka, socio-economic development. And these are the legitimate things. These are the understandable things. What happened in between Sri Lanka is the ethnic problem. And that is primarily a domestic issue of Sri Lanka. But in case of South Asia, there are different type of problems. We have international borders with divided social boundaries, because there is a Tamil stock of population in Sri Lanka. There is also Tamil stock of population which is having strong cultural roots towards across the Pak states in India. There are divided Bengali community in Bangladesh and India. The Punjabi divided between Pakistan and India. It sometimes creates a problem, sometimes misunderstanding, sometimes confusion it creates. So that is the understandable. India has a legitimate concern. Sri Lanka has a legitimate sensitivity. How to resolve this problem? That is the issue. So the Sri Lankan Tamil problem, the ethnic problem, has ancient roots. It's not during the colonial period. Before that, there were Tamil Sinhala kingdoms. That is not our domain here to discuss all these things. But during the post-colonial period, government of Sri Lanka, being a democratic government, and which is primarily a majoritarian government, of course, on the name of majority, quite often the minority rules if they are the consolidated force. So that is the different dynamics of the democratic system. But government of Sri Lanka attempted certain kind of recorrection of the policies pursued during the colonial regime. That recorrection of the certain policies invited reactions from the Tamil stock of population. That quite often aggravated, but India did not take interest. But in case of Sri Lanka and India, Sri Lanka has two major crises in its foreign policy. And in both the crises, which I call the acid test of Sri Lankan foreign policy, and in that India stood with Sri Lanka. The first was when the state sector was nationalized. There was heavy international pressure on Sri Lanka. India stood with Sri Lanka. And the second, the ethnic crisis, the final stage of the dealing with the ethnic crisis during 2008 and 9, when India stood with Sri Lanka. So these two were the acid test of Sri Lankan foreign policy, when global community was pressurizing Sri Lanka on one pretext or the other, but India stood with. But during the decade of 80s, that I call it dangerous decade, because if I recall my personal experience, I visited Sri Lanka as a student in 1982. And I saw a sentiment of optimism, and I thought this island nation will do some miracles. But later on, I frequently visited, and I saw a sentiment of pessimism because of this ethnic problem for nearly 3 decades. So when the ethnic problem erupted in 83, it was difficult to contain, because the ethnic forces, the secessionist forces were so strong, they were demanding separate state. And it was neither in India's interest nor in Sri Lanka's interest. And it was not permitted by neither Sri Lanka nor India to have a separate state like Tamil Eelam within Sri Lanka. So the Sri Lankan interest and Indian interest were having convergence to have a particular type of relationship in which pan-Sri Lankan society can evolve, thrive, and develop. So in that context, when the ethnic crisis erupted and the government of Sri Lanka, naturally the legitimate government shall have to take certain recourse, even the military action, if situation is deteriorating beyond certain limit, it was the legitimate action. But Indian side, the Tamil stock of population had certain kind of sensitivities towards this. And they pressurized the government in New Delhi that there is the discrimination against the Tamil stock of population, where two ethnic groups are polarized, that is the Tamil and the Sinhalese, and Sinhalese being a majoritarian government in a democratic society, the Tamil rights are being violated, Tamils are being discriminated, and these type of feelings came into being. Then the India offered a sort of good offices that you resolve this problem in your own way, but it should not deteriorate, and its spillover effects should not be on the Indian side. So this thing was going on, and India tried to bring both the forces, the legitimate state forces, state government, the government, and the illegitimate forces which were pressurizing and creating problem in the Sri Lankan society together. That was the Indian position. Meanwhile, due to different reasons, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was assassinated by an extremist, some members of the extremist group, and the Rajiv Gandhi, who was not politically or mentally prepared to handle the political issues, became the Prime Minister of India. He had a gentleman's politics. He wanted to resolve all the problems. He went to Pakistan to have a confidence building agreement and manage the things with Mrs. Benazir Bhutto. He also tried to have certain negotiation agreements in Punjab, Assam to resolve the problem. And he has a sensitivity that the issue of ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka should also be resolved for once and all. And for that, Rajiv Gandhi started conversing, having negotiations with Sri Lanka authorities. And you know that Lalita Tulat Mudali went to there to meet him, and so many things went on. So ultimately, the negotiating process during Rajiv Gandhi's period, and when their Sri Lankan government was pursuing the military option to blockade the Jaffna area, India attempted to a sort of airdropping of the humanitarian assistance like food items, medicines, and Sri Lankan media and maybe some of the leaders perceived it as Indian interference in Sri Lankan sovereignty. It's a violation of Indian Sri Lankan airspace. And that has created a conflict kind of situation. Misunderstanding have deepened. So the whole process and India's attempt to have some humanitarian support to the Tamil population, which was being blockaded, and having some military option was being pursued, then it was culminated in India-Sri Lanka Accord. And this accord variously analyzed the persons in the jurisprudence have analyzed its all the sections of the agreement and everything, but that is not our domain here. We are not from the judiciary or the advocacy side. But what the President Jayawarden at that point of time, he had two options. To pursue the same option which he was pursuing and make the Sri Lankan situation deteriorate and it have disastrous impact for the Sri Lankan society. The second option was to come in a negotiating position with India, bring India into the picture to resolve the problem and make India party to it. And when this negotiation was, agreement was concluded, the media and the persons variously reacted, and there were certain loose type of comments like President Jayawarden told now Rajiv referee has entered in the ring to fight my battle. Similarly, in the Indian side, President Jayawarden, being a shrewd politician, made Rajiv Gandhi to do the dirty thing which he could not do by his own might. These loose comments came from different sides. It created so many misunderstandings. These are not so academically so relevant, but misunderstanding have been created. So we shall have to think about these type of things. But when we analyze the various sections, various parts of the agreement, it was the best agreement to resolve the Sri Lankan ethnic problem, to give the Sri Lankan Tamils, the Tamil stock of population, what they were expecting, a separate homeland kind of thing, not exactly homeland, but just a merger of the north and eastern province, and then the Tamils will have their autonomy in that area. Similarly, for the Sri Lankan side, it was expected to provide the security and peace, to bring peace in any way. So it was the best option. But problem erupted when it is being analyzed by some of the scholars that India was very enthusiastic and willing to conclude the agreement, when the Tamil and the government of Sri Lanka side were somewhat reluctant to conclude this Indo-Sri Lanka agreement. It may have certain kind of a sense in terms of icon of truth in it, but when agreement was concluded, there were certain provisions which were to be implemented within 48 hours, 72 hours, and then if the situation is deteriorating, then India will be sending its force on the invitation of the Sri Lanka. All these things came into, these were the provisions in that agreement. So President of Sri Lanka offered India, invited India to resolve this issue, to implement the agreement in word and spirit. And it has created some kind of dissension in the Sri Lankan political leadership, even within the government of Sri Lanka. Because some ministers were not happy with the way agreement was concluded. Others were not happy about the certain provisions and sections of the agreement. And at the same time, another extremist group that we call the Sinhala extremist group, the JVP, was also making a political capital out of it on the name of the Sinhala extreme nationalism. So it has created a very, very complex situation how to implement this agreement, though India attempted to implement it. Or thereafter, the government of Sri Lanka requested the government of India to withdraw, considering the situation, the mess which has been created in the Sri Lankan situation because of the agreement. The government of Sri Lanka requested Indian peacekeeping forces and government of India to withdraw these forces. And India withdrew these forces in an amicable manner. But this, what we expected, what Rajiv Gandhi expected, what President Jaywardhan was expected, it did not take place. Some unanticipated consequences took place during the implementation of this agreement. And later on, what happened with what imprints it had, because the merger was demerged with the Supreme Court judgment, and some more problems came up. But what agreement did is, agreement helped LTT to emerge as a sole exponent, sole leader of the Tamil movement, separatist movement. And other smaller groups were sidelined in the process. Similarly, the extreme Sinhala group, the JVP, also became strong. That is the net result of the agreement. And it has created different kind of problems in Sri Lanka. The Tamil LTT as extreme group, JVP as extreme group, then the withdrawal of the IPK. So the Sri Lanka government and Sri Lankan society got into a situation of catch-22 situation. So what government of India expected, what the government of Sri Lanka expected, what the extremist groups were expecting, no one got its due, what they were expecting and what they are not expecting. So it has created a problem, and that is why I called it a dangerous decade in this India-Sri Lanka relations. After the India's withdrawal, I briefly talk about its imprints. What happened is, thereafter India refrained itself to getting involved in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka. Though India had a sensitized approach, India has a clear perspective that the legitimate grievances of any group in any society in a democratic way must be resolved. This is India's consistent policy. But India remained indifferent about the involvement of in Sri Lankan internal affairs. Then the Norwegian came, they tried to resolve the problem, and due to the adamant position of extremist groups, they could not resolve. Then the government of Sri Lanka attempted the different measures, and India provided wholehearted support. So in this way, government of Sri Lanka sometimes has a different perception. Different governments have a different perception of India, and that might be the hypersensitivity of the small state. Because in the small state, if the big state is taking much interest, maybe the positive involvement, but because of the state being small, it has sensitivities that the big state may have some ulterior motive. So similarly, if the big state is not taking interest, completely indifferent, it means the big state will be accused that it is not performing its responsibilities, not discharging its duties towards the smaller states. So the big state has certain dilemmas. But in case of India and Sri Lanka, I think there had been certain irritants. Of course, there had been the disputes, but most of the disputes have been amicably resolved. And now both the countries are focusing on the trade, investment, development. But China factor, again, they're becoming a problem. Problem in the sense how it is becoming is not the problem per se, but the think tank, hawkish think tank perception and media portrayal is sometimes creating misunderstanding, blowing certain decisions, certain policies out of proportion. And it creates a misunderstanding at the level of public opinion, not at the government's level. So India and Sri Lanka, the government level, I think relations are cordial. I don't think there is any problem. But the media portrayal and the think tank perception on both sides sometimes creates the misunderstanding. That is the problem. As regards the people-to-people contact, in North India, Indians are little concerned about Sri Lankan situation, very little concern. In North India, if something happening in the Middle East, North Indians are concerned because some of their relative is working in Middle East. So large number of remittances or the amount is coming from the Middle East. So they have some connection with the Middle East. But North India is not having much connection with Sri Lanka, so they have no concern. But in South India, there's immediate reaction if something is happening in Sri Lanka. So that is quite understandable. So the best option right at the moment can be to increase, to enhance the people-to-people contact. That can be helpful. So the Rajiv period, it was neither expected by the government of Sri Lanka, nor by the Rajiv Gandhi, nor anticipated by the scholarly community. But this decade turned out as a dangerous decade. That is the challenge, and how to erase that image of this decade is the big challenge. Because whatever the studies we have, they are more like advocacy studies, more like the opinionated studies. Still I feel there is no scientific study of realistic assessment of the impact of India-Sri Lanka accord on the Sri Lankan society, on the Indian society. So I think it needs to be deeply investigated. There should be the deeper investigation of the impact of India-Sri Lanka pact on the Sri Lankan society, on the Indian society, and how it has been misjudged by both the sides. So the judgmental error, how it took place. So there are certain issues which must be analyzed in a detailed and in the insightful manner. But this is not the time to go into the details on all these aspects. So with these words, I would like to stop here, and the questions and the queries might be definitely, because it's a controversial thing. So over to Dr. George, questions and queries.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for that very lucid explanation. Looking at not just the foreign policy during this period, you tried to explain Indo-Lanka ties going back decades from independence, because we've had a similar trajectory, and you talked about the similarities, because it's very important to focus on those commonalities. There's so much that can divide countries, but there's also a lot that can combine, bring together countries, especially from a foreign policy perspective. The floor is open. Please feel free to write your question in the chat box and send it in. We will be fielding those to Professor Karori Singh. Professor, if we were to just start off the conversation, there was, as you mentioned, a lot of difference between the Indira Gandhi period into the Rajiv Gandhi period. Mrs. Gandhi and Mr. Jayawardena did not exactly see eye to eye, but maybe Mr. Jayawardena felt he could have worked better with Rajiv Gandhi, and that's what he tried to do, and that's what he succeeded to a large extent in doing. To what extent do you feel the fact that Rajiv Gandhi came in fresh? He did not bring in, he brought in his family lineage, he brought in that context, but the fact that, as you mentioned, he was trying to reach out to Pakistan, trying to resolve other issues that India was facing, looking at the neighborhood. Do you think that really went a long way in enhancing relations at that time?
Yes, Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi are different in not only in their style, but their training, their understanding of the international affairs. Mrs. Gandhi had a long political training right from the pre-colonial period, because during the freedom struggle, the leaders of freedom movement used to have some discussions at Pandit Nehru's place. So she was having deeper insight into international relations, and that's why she became somewhat politician, deeper politician, because the politics is not a business of the gentleman. Politics is a different kind of thing. It's the art of possible, as Henry Kissinger told long back. So the politics is a different type of game. Rajiv Gandhi was not prepared for that. And that is why Rajiv Gandhi had a dream to resolve, have a peaceful, prosperous world, the ideal world we have, and resolve whatever the conflicts are there within India, or between India and Pakistan, between India and China, because he was the Indian Prime Minister who visited China in 34 years. So he wanted to resolve each and every issue in a gentleman's way. But politics is not that simple when the sovereign states are interacting. Because in the behavior of the state, how states behave, sovereign states behave, is a different kind of behavior. So that in politics, and particularly the interstate relations, I think the diplomatic competency and negotiating skills are more important. And Rajiv Gandhi personally was not having that sort of diplomatic competency and the negotiating skills. Whatever he was advised, he took everything on the face value. But when dealing with states, interstate relations, everything cannot be taken on the face value. So that might have been proved his weakness, but that is also a strength. If he would have survived for the longer, it have been proved his strength as a statesman to resolve so many issues. But that is the different story. He was assassinated. He could not rule beyond certain period. It was just 5 years period. So that's the different story. There is no any hypothetical situation. But Rajiv Gandhi and Indira Gandhi both have altogether different understanding, perception, training, and the personality as a political leader. So that is understandable. Whereas, as regards the President Jayawardena, you might be knowing he was a little bit more shrewd than Rajiv Gandhi. You will believe it as a scholar, because how he crossed so many ladders in his own party, how he was thrown down in every step. So Rajiv, relatively Jayawardena was more shrewd, so Jayawardena wanted to solve the problem. Sometimes if we are becoming more shrewd to resolve the problem, we are creating a trap to put ourselves in that. So if we are becoming over-shrewd, outsmart, then we are creating problem. If we are simplified way we are dealing, then again we are creating problem. There must be some balance of the shrewdness and simplicity. I think that can work in international relations in a more practical manner. Please, Doctor.
Absolutely, absolutely, Professor. This is where we also come to that point, and you raised two particular incidents in which India continued to support Sri Lanka, especially when it came to foreign policy in the international domain. If I were to go to just one particular incident, now we know that President Jayawardena and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi met on several occasions. They met mostly in India, they met in Sri Lanka as well. There was the attempted assault, or rather the assault on the Indian Prime Minister when he came to Sri Lanka in 1987, when he was being accorded the Guard of Honor. What impact did this have? Now, of course, at that point, thankfully, he escaped unhurt, but he was rushed out of the country on that occasion. What impact did this have on Indo-Lanka relations at that particular juncture, given the backdrop of the Indo-Lanka Accord, that particular incident? If you could elaborate on that particular incident, sir.
You see, naturally, India had a feeling that the Prime Minister, he was not an individual as an Indian citizen. He was the Prime Minister of India. So in most of the sections, it was perceived as an attack on India simply. But India had a maturity, we Indian citizens in general had a maturity that it's not done by the government of Sri Lanka, it's not instigated by the government of Sri Lanka. This can be the isolated incident, and there might be some intelligence failure or might be some problem like that. So India did not overreact at that point of time. India showed the maturity, but certainly India felt it because it was not an attack on an individual, it was on the Prime Minister, and that is understandable. I think the Sri Lanka, maybe the small state, but understand the Sri Lankan citizens will understand the Indian sensitivities as the India having regard of the Sri Lankan sensitivities. Definitely Indians felt it, but India had maturity also that it was not instigated by the government of Sri Lanka or by Sri Lankan system, but there was some intelligence failure and a systemic lapse on the part of the Sri Lankan government, definitely. Yes.
So, Professor, a question has come in where they're asking, when it comes to the Indo-Lanka Accord and the inclusion of Trincomalee, from an Indian perspective, how would you reflect on the inclusion of Trincomalee? I guess this is coming from the fact that the Indian side insisted on the fact that we should say that Trincomalee will not be used against the interests of India. So I guess that is what this question is all about. Asking about the Indian perception of Trincomalee and the significance of Trincomalee to even have it included in the Indo-Lanka Accord.
You see, the Trincomalee has a sort of strategic importance for India, for Sri Lanka, for both. If there is some extra regional involvement in the Trincomalee area, definitely India will be the sensitive because India may not be the superpower, but certainly India has a particular position in the South Asian region. So India has that perception that in the Indian, not only in Trincomalee, but Indian Ocean as a whole, and now it has been reflected in the India Sagar concept and the tripartite talk between Sri Lanka, Maldives, and India in the naval security and like this. So India is certainly sensitive about that. But if the Sri Lanka is developing its harbor, I don't think there is any problem. India always helped. When tsunami came, India immediately helped. When government of Sri Lanka was dealing with the extremist group 2008, 2009, India rather supported, did not react against the government of Sri Lanka and Indian military, rather supported India at that point of time. So India is sensitive, and I told you in the beginning, India has abiding commitment for unity, integrity, and sovereignty of the Sri Lanka. It is in India's interest. It is not India is the benevolent. That is why India is having that sort of perception, that abiding faith in Sri Lankan integrity, unity, and sovereignty. It is in India's interest, India's own interest. And that is why India has a clear perception, but only one sensitivity India has, that in the Indian Ocean region, but Quad has been developed because of that. If there is some extra regional involvement from the strategic point of view, from the military point of view, then India is sensitive. If some extra regional power is helping Sri Lanka in its development, in the infrastructure development, in investment, no problem. I don't think India will have any sensitivity, because India cannot help beyond certain limit. And in Sri Lanka is the first country with which India has a free trade agreement. Because at the turn of the century, India intensified the trade and developmental cooperation with Sri Lanka. So India has a clear-cut perception. There is no confusion about it. And I think my personal perception is Sri Lanka is responding most appropriately. Because when we see the history of India-Sri Lanka relations during the post-colonial period, government of Sri Lanka, whatever the decision they took, they kept Delhi informed about, right from Sir Kotlewala and Sinanaike's time. Always frequently visited Delhi to inform the leadership in Delhi that what's happening in Sri Lanka in internal affairs. So it's not a matter of that India is sensitive. In the government of Sri Lanka is sensitive, and Sri Lankan leadership is always taking Delhi into confidence whatever happening in Sri Lanka. So I don't think there is any problem. India has a sensitivity, and Sri Lanka is responding most appropriately and in a sensitive manner. I don't think there is any problem. Of course, sometimes media blow something out of proportion. That is just to have a TRP and something like this. Maybe in Sri Lanka as well, this may be true. But as regards the government-to-government relation concern, I think most cordial relation, people-to-people relation, most cordial. But there are certain, because the think tanks, they have their own training, own understanding, their hawkish mindset. So they think things in their own mindset, that framework. Similarly, the media has its own perception. They portray things in a different way. But these make sometimes form a particular public opinion. They create the public opinion. Then the problem comes up. And then the government comes into the picture. So the media and think tank, they affect the public opinion. Otherwise, people-to-people relations are cordial. Government-to-government relations are in a good understanding. I don't think there is any problem. Right. Okay, over. George.
Professor, part of the Indo-Lanka Accord was the induction of the IPKF and then various constitutional changes in Sri Lanka. Do you personally think, when you reflect on that particular period, the fact that Rajiv Gandhi went out of power in 89, Jaya Jayawardena went out of power in 88, the two main architects were not around anymore, do you think that had an adverse impact on the plan that they had or what they had strategized for the two countries?
You see, this is the problem with the developing countries, because most of the developing countries, the system is not so professional and institutionalized. The personality and the leadership has a great impact on any of the policy taking place in developing countries. In Western countries, most of the Western countries, things are institutionalized. So the personality is not having so much greater impact. But in case of India and Sri Lanka, definitely the untimely departure of Rajiv Gandhi and the Jayawardena was not in power. So it was not implemented as both the leaders were expected. I think both the leaders have some kind of understanding with which their successor leaders might not be having that sort of understanding and perception. So that might be one of the reasons. But another thing is in Sri Lanka, because of the long democratic tradition, Sri Lankan people are the freedom lovers. And not only the Sri Lankan media, some Western media also created a sort of opinion that it's the Indian forces from outside, it's an intervention by the India and something like this. This sort of situation was created. It had some impact. So ultimately the issue was not resolved. And the IPKF shall have to withdraw. Even within the Jayawardene time, within the Jayawardene government, there were differences, the Premadasa, and they were not in favor of the agreement, the way it was concluded. So definitely it has an impact. If Jayawardene, it's a hypothetical situation, if Rajiv Gandhi and Jayawardene would have continued for some time, I think this problem would have been solved by 92 or so.
Because even the biographers, Howard Riggins and K.M. De Silva, who did the biography on Jaya Jayawardena, they reflect on the point that Rajiv Gandhi was quite keen to see Jaya Jayawardena serving a third term. Although it was not possible at that point in Sri Lanka constitutionally to have a third term, they say that he brought pressure on Jaya Jayawardena to change the constitution. But of course, this remains very much conjecture in academic debate, because this was what they got out of certain interviews that they had conducted. But certainly, as you mentioned, the fact that the two main characters, the two main players are moving out, that would have really changed dynamics at that stage. Professor, a question has come in, and this is with regard, of course, we are going slightly back, but this is information that came out in the Rajiv Gandhi period, where it was known that Indo-Lanka ties were affected to some extent with the knowledge or with the awareness later on that during the first half of the 1980s, there had been the training of the LTTE in India. Now, this obviously had a negative impact on Indo-Lanka ties later on. How do you think this played out in the Rajiv Gandhi Jaya Jayawardena period? Did it affect it?
Because there are certain writings which are giving reference that India has provided some training in the southern part of India, but I have no knowledge about that because there is no conclusive evidence. Sometimes we are having imaginative evidence and we are conducting interview of a couple of persons, and that is why my perception is in international relations we are lacking the scientific studies. Most of the studies are the perceptual, opinionated, and the advocacy kind of things. Whatever I do have my mindset, accordingly I will imagine and I will describe the events. And suppose I want to prove something, I will take the 10 isolated incidents and I will say this is the thing. I will take another 10 incidents and I will prove the contrary thing about that. That is what happening in international relations. We are lacking the scientific study on not only in India-Sri Lanka relation, even about the international relations. Very limited studies which we can call valid from the scientific point of view. Scientifically valid studies are very, very limited. But Jayawardene entered in the agreement willingly. Willingly in the sense when Jayawardene was pursuing the military option, he was being pressurized by the global community, the Western countries, from every side he was pressurized. And he was not having option how to deal with it. And meanwhile, India attempted airdrop on the humanitarian ground, the food and the medicines to the Jaffna when it was blockaded. So Jayawardene was pressurized. So Jayawardene willingly came into agreement that now India should get involved. So the Western power, other powers should not pressurize. They should not take interest in Sri Lankan affairs. So India should help to resolve the problem, and India had a commitment to resolve the ethnic problem for once and all. It is the India's stated position. So there was a convergence of the India's position and Jayawardene's willingness, because he was having pressure from Western countries, from so many countries from around the world, and the human rights organizations and so many organizations, and internal displacement was taking place at large scale. So there were problems. So Jayawardene was pressurized. So willingly Jayawardene came, but in his own cabinet and the political parties in opposition had a different perception of the things. Because Jayawardene himself was involved, he was in the thick of the situation, how to deal with the situation. But others were not so much involved in the thick of the situation. So they were not understanding the limitations of the Jayawardene and limitations of the Rajiv Gandhi. Both the leaders had their own limitations. So they willingly came together and concluded this agreement to resolve this problem and to provide maximum relief to the Tamil people and address their grievances, whatever the grievances they had. It was the most viable option viable redressal of their grievances. There cannot be better grievance redressal than this agreement. Even today, there cannot be better grievance redressal model for the Sri Lankan situation. Yes, over to George.
Professor, there's another question that's coming in, which is saying, did the Rajiv Gandhi administration in 1987 believe that Sri Lanka was able to successfully follow the same federalist democracy as practiced in India by introducing power devolution through the Indo-Lanka Accord? After 30 years, power devolution has not yet been successfully implemented in Sri Lanka. However, this foreign policy of India is indifferent if a Congress government or a BJP government is in power. What is the form of consistency? And just going back to the original point there, did the Rajiv Gandhi administration really believe that a federal system would work in Sri Lanka?
You see, India has a consistent policy. Consistent policy in one point that the Tamil grievances should be addressed. Sri Lanka must have a pan-Sri Lankan nationalism. Sri Lanka must be united, sovereign, integrated nation, no problem. But grievances of every community should be redressed within India and even in Sri Lanka. And that is why India has a neighborhood first policy. Because India has a concern about the neighbors to help them in their developmental process. So that India's perception is very, very clear. If there is some disturbance in the neighborhood, it will certainly have some spillover effects on Indian society, Indian state. If there is some problem in Bangladesh, definitely India will be affected. If there is a problem in Sri Lanka, India, maybe southern part is affected, not the North India. If there is some problem on the Pakistan side of Punjab, India will be affected. So it's obvious that the communities were divided. So it's an obvious thing that India has a clear perception that there should be peace and prosperity in the neighborhood. It's in India's interest. India's concern is about the strategic and the security concern, maritime security in case of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean. That is the legitimate India's concern. And I don't think Sri Lanka is going against that India's concern. Sri Lanka is responding appropriately to address this India's concern, India's sensitivity. I don't think there is any problem. So India's perception is clear. Whatever done during the Rajiv Gandhi's regime, that was the best option for addressing the Tamil problems. And now, still there, if there is some problem, the Tamils should not feel discriminated in the Sri Lankan society. It is in the interest of the Sri Lanka. So there must be some kind of pan-Sri Lankan nationalism. There should not be separate kind of narratives, the Tamil narratives, the Sinhala narratives, the Tamil kingdom, the Sinhala kingdom. That sort of mindset shall have to overcome. So there must be some Sri Lankan symbols, Sri Lankan literature. We can say it's the Sri Lankan narrative, it's the Sri Lankan literature, it is the Sri Lankan symbol, not the Sinhala or Tamil symbol. So that sort of separatist kind should not happen in the Sri Lankan situation. At the initial stage, there must be some reconstruction measures that are already taking place in the north and eastern measures. Reconstruction is not a problem, it's some kind of physical kind of things. But rebuilding the society and culture is a different thing. And for that, we must have a reconciliatory literature, reconciliatory symbols, reconciliation of the linguistic reconciliation. All these things must be learned. Still, I feel in Sri Lanka, the Tamils are referring to learn Sinhalese and Sinhalese are referring to learn the Tamil. It is not the best interest of the Sri Lanka. So the Tamil can be taught in the down south and the Sinhala can be taught in the Tamil area. So there must be some kind of pan-Sri Lankan that shall have to be developed, because the nation is not merely the political and economic. Nation is the cultural, art, architecture, all these things are reflected in the nation. Then the nation can be sustainable. Otherwise, can't be through only on the basis of economy and polity. We cannot sustain a nation beyond certain limit. Otherwise, nation will crop up again. In Germany, there was a German wall collapse because the nations were there. Both were having the same nationality, same nation, feeling of nationality. So the Berlin Wall collapsed and Germany became the united. So that sort of nation must be created for a long period of time. The two Germans have a different economic system, different political system, but the sustainable nationality they could not create. Even the Pakistan could not create the Pakistani nation even today, facing so many problems, the Baluch, Pashtun, and because the Pakistan was created in 1947 with the partition of Indian subcontinent. But the Pakistani nationalism could not gain roots. The Baluch nationalism is older and stronger than the Pakistani nationalism. So that shall have to be created through the art, culture, and literature. And I think that is in the interest of the Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan intellectual community, the think tank, they should come forward to create the Pan Sri Lankan art, culture, and literature to strengthen the Sri Lanka, not the Tamil Sri Lanka or the Sinhala Sri Lanka. I think that can be the best option. Even for India, that can be the best option. But relatively, India could strengthen the nationalism to some extent because of the historical roots and the roots of the freedom struggle, that background is there. So India is not that much so divided, but Pakistan, Sri Lanka, they have some kind of division, some kind of problems. So the ultimately responsibility lies on the intelligentsia, intellectuals. I will not blame politicians because politicians have their own political interest. The commercials, the corporates, they have their own commercial interest, but nation cannot be sustained through the commerce and politics. Nation can be sustained through art, culture, and literature. And here responsibility lies on the intellectuals and more on Sri Lankan intellectuals, not the outside intellectuals.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's such a valid point, Professor. And actually, going back to India, and when you look at the Nehru period, I guess one of the biggest contributions that Jawaharlal Nehru made to India was that Indianness, promoting the Indian label, everybody gathering under one flag, despite the disparity, despite the differences, religious, language, regions. There's so much of difference in this massive country. But Jawaharlal Nehru was able to unite a country under one slogan, that was India. I guess that is a lesson for us to keep on learning, not only in the Indian context, but in the Sri Lankan context or globally as well, in terms of what happened there. Professor, just one final question before we wrap up. You started your academic career in the 1980s. You were privy to what was happening in the Indira Gandhi period into the Rajiv Gandhi period. Professor, if you, from an Indian perspective, as an Indian academic, when you look at Sri Lanka in that period, and you look at the president of that time, Jaya Jayawardena, you mentioned the word shrewd at one point, and he was much more shrewd than Rajiv Gandhi, who was rather tender, having come in only a few years before that. From an Indian perspective, how would you perceive Jaya Jayawardena? What would be an analysis you would give of Jaya Jayawardena as the leader in Sri Lanka at that time?
You see, I don't proclaim that my perception, my view is the Indian view. It is my personal opinion, a personal view about the Sri Lankan situation, because I do have a sense of empathy towards Sri Lanka. During my early days, I worked in Sri Lankan 3 villages near Gampala, Gampalavela, Maliga Purana, Mahapurana. And I stayed in these villages for a couple of months. And I realized these villagers, they were not knowing what the nationality, what India, and what is Sri Lanka. They were not knowing anything about that. And they were so affectionate. And when I left these villages, some of them started weeping. Why are you leaving? You stay here in the villages. You are our brother, and something like this. And some ladies, what I used to call Amma, they started weeping. Why are you leaving like that? So humans are same everywhere. They have sentiment, they have emotions, but problems are being created over a period of time. Due to political reasons, due to national boundaries, that territoriality, and all these things, problems are being created. They know nobody born with the problems. Problems are our own creation. So if problems are our own creation, we can resolve them. But as regards the Nehru and Sri Lankan situation, India has a continuous leadership of Nehru nearly 17 years. Whereas in Sri Lanka, nearly 5 prime ministers changed during 5 or 6 prime ministers changed during the period. So there was no so much continuity. And the second thing in case of Sri Lanka is India was partisan. Muslims were discriminated during the colonial period. Hindus were getting certain privileged positions in the colonial period. So Muslims had certain kind of grievances, though India was partisan. But in India, the majority was getting some privileges, minority was deprived, feeling deprived, having perception of deprivation. In Sri Lanka, minority was privileged during the colonial period. And the majority was having a perception or maybe reality of the deprivation, you can call it reality as well. So the Sri Lankan situation is different. J.R. Javardhana's perception, he is a shrewd politician. He shall have to be, if you are in politics, you shall have to be shrewd. Things are not on face value. You must understand the intrinsic values. Success of a politician is how you can get served the interest of your nation. That is the measure of success of a leader. So Javardhan was successful in sustaining his leadership in the party to ruling Sri Lanka for nearly 17 years. He had a calculated move that how the UNP can be power for a long period of time. Otherwise, earlier there was alternate governments were there. So he calculated UNP as a single political party, got the largest vote every time. But governments changed because of the number of seats. So he calculated and transformed the system from the Gaullist model or a sort of hybrid system of the presidential and the parliamentary system, calculated way to sustain himself in power. It was the good for him. But it has created certain problems for the Sri Lankan society as a whole. So his shrewdness to deal with Sri Lanka, deal with United States, deal with European powers, deal with India at the same time, through the shrewdness and having tilt towards the Western countries for a particular point of time. So in Javardhan somewhat maintained the distance. Otherwise, most of the Sri Lankan leaders, Kotlewala or Mahinda Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Sirisena, all these leaders kept Delhi informed about the developments taking in Sri Lanka. So the Javardhan tried to be shrewd, and he has, being a shrewd, he sustained himself in power for a long period of time. That is good for him. But Sri Lanka as a whole, my personal perception is he did something good. Good in the sense the liberalization, the opening up. It's a good thing. But because of the eruption of the ethnic problem, what could have been the benefits of the opening up, benefits of the liberalization, Sri Lanka could not gain. And this problem was erupted because of the shrewdness of the Javardhan. Otherwise, this problem would not have erupted to this extent. Problem was there, but it should not have been like this. So he did good thing, bad thing. It's the mixed things. The assessment should not be the one-sided. Because I personally have a different type of feelings. But it's a sort of mixed kind of thing. He did certain good things for the Sri Lanka. He did good thing for the UNP as a political party. So the liberalization, and Sri Lanka is the first South Asian country to liberalize. And during those days, there was in Gaul Road, there was duty-free shop, and people were going from all the South Asian countries to buy duty-free things from there. And when there was restrictions in all the South Asian countries, and at that point of time, it was thinking that Sri Lanka may become Switzerland or maybe the Singapore like that. It was that expectation. But later on, it's the sorry state of affair for nearly three decades. So that point of time, Sri Lanka lost a lot of courage and lot of development perspective because of this. So it must be the mixed assessment and not one-sided. He did certain good things, but his certain calculations failed. His calculation to sustain himself in power succeeded successfully. His calculation to manage certain things, manage India, manage the Sri Lankan Tamil problem, could not deliver the goods, unexpected results. Even Rajiv Gandhi and Javardhana both did not expect this will be the result of the IPK, but this will be the result of the accord. So unanticipated consequences took place. Both the leaders did not expect it. They were not anticipating such kind of conclusions. So he did certain good things, certain things which resulted into unanticipated consequences. It's a sort of mixed kind of thing. Yes, over, George.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where we've got to, especially from an academic perspective, understand different sides of a situation, understand different perceptions. And that's the very reason why I asked you that question, Professor, because you're someone who has done extensive research on coalitions in Sri Lanka as well. Some of your writings are landmark writings when it comes to the building of coalitions in Sri Lanka, which I have personally had the honor of quoting in the work over here. So thank you very much, Professor, for taking time, for sharing your views, your ideas, reflecting on this particular period. Because another interesting point that comes out of this period is that Rajiv Gandhi and Jaya Jayawardena were both nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1988 by an American. Stephen Solarz nominated them. Of course, they didn't go on to win it, but it was interesting how America gets into the picture at that stage, and an American decides to nominate the two of them for having achieved some semblance, some degree of peace, stability, at least during that period, although things were going to change very drastically in the years ahead. And as you said, they were not sure that this was going to happen. They obviously did not foresee the developments that took place thereafter. And out of the two countries, no doubt Sri Lanka suffered extensively with the conflict, which continued to rage, which claimed lives of thousands, maimed, injured so many, destroyed so much of property. And this country, more than anything else, the country was set back in a big way. So thank you so much, Professor, once again for your reflections as we looked at.
Thank you, Dr. George. And I'm grateful to Awarelogue, and I'm sure the Awarelogue will flourish by making the constructive contribution and the creative writings, not merely the advocacy and something like that, opinionated, but something constructive in promoting the national unity of Sri Lanka, India, and the dignity of the nations. Because in dimension, nations can be the bigger or larger and smaller. But in dignity, every nation state has the same position, whether Sri Lanka, India. So that sort of equity you will sustain in your writings, in your think tank perception. Every nation, every state has its own dignity, maybe different in dimensions. That's all. It's so nice of you. I enjoyed the discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. George, and our Awarelogue initiative. I wish it will flourish.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We have lots of participants from India today too, who have taken a keen interest in being a part of this session, to listen to you, Professor, and also understand this particular topic that much more. Thank you. Thank you once again to you and to everyone who joined us on this session of the Awarelogue Lecture Forum. We have more coming up. We've got the culture site coming up in a couple of weeks. We've got the next session of the Awarelogue Lecture Forum coming up. We also have the Decoding Diplomacy series, as well as the book list, all of which are coming up in the next couple of weeks. And we invite you to continue to engage with the Awarelogue initiative. Thank you once again, Professor.
Yes, Bahama Stuti.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.